Something just broke between the United States and Canada, and almost nobody is talking about it the way they should be. A piece of intelligence surfaced from inside the Pentagon. Not a leak, not a rumor, an official announcement. And what it revealed about the state of the most important military partnership in the Western Hemisphere should be sending shockwaves through every newsroom in North America. Instead, it's buried under the noise. So let's pull it out of the darkness and put it right in front of you, because what's happening between Washington and Ottawa right now is not a disagreement. It's not a diplomatic spat. It is something far more serious. And by the time you finish watching this, you will understand exactly why the decisions being made this week could reshape the entire continental security architecture that has protected North America for over 8 decades. Let's go back to 1940 for just a moment. The world was on fire. Nazi Germany had swept through Europe. Britain was being bombed into rubble. And 2 leaders, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and William Lyon Mackenzie King, sat down and built something extraordinary. A permanent institutional bridge between the United States and Canada, a joint defense board so foundational, so deeply woven into the fabric of continental security that it helped design NORAD, helped plan the early warning radar systems stretching across the frozen Arctic, and helped architect the St. Lawrence Seaway. That institution survived every war, every recession, every political storm, every shift in leadership, every decade of turbulence for 86 consecutive years. Until now. The Pentagon just froze it. And the reason they gave when pushed for an explanation was that Canada is no longer, in their exact words, a credible partner in the mutual defense of this continent. 86 years suspended, not for a missed meeting, frozen as a deliberate, calculated political signal. And what that signal means for you is something the mainstream media is not fully explaining. So that's exactly what we're going to do right now. Here's where the crack first appeared. January 20th, 2026, the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney took the stage in front of the most powerful financial and political minds on the planet and said something that quietly ignited a chain of events leading directly to that Pentagon freeze 4 months later. Carney talked about a rupture in the world order. He described great powers weaponizing economic integration, using trade as a lever, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be deliberately exploited. He never named the United States. He never had to. Everyone in that room knew exactly who he meant. And more importantly, the people watching from inside the Pentagon knew too. Now here is the detail almost nobody is highlighting. When Elbridge Colby, the Pentagon's Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, publicly announced the suspension of the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, he specifically cited Carney's Davos speech by name. He connected the freeze directly to what he called the gap between Canadian rhetoric and Canadian action. Think about what that means. The most powerful military institution on Earth just admitted it froze an 86-year-old defense board, at least partially, because of a speech. Not a broken treaty, not a military failure, a speech at an economic forum in Switzerland. That is not a procurement dispute. That is a political warning dressed in the language of defense cooperation. But to really understand what's happening here, you cannot just look at the speech. You have to look at what happened after it. Because in the weeks and months that followed Davos, Mark Carney didn't slow down. He accelerated. Within days, Carney was in Beijing, signing a trade arrangement with China at a scale no Canadian Prime Minister had attempted since 2017. The same week Washington was watching his Davos speech with narrowed eyes, Canada was deepening ties with America's primary global rival. From Beijing, Carney moved to France, then Qatar, then India in February, then Japan in early March, where he launched a comprehensive strategic partnership covering defense cooperation, cybersecurity, supply chain resilience, and Alberta natural gas flowing directly into Japanese ports. At the Munich Security Conference, Canada joined the European Union's Security Action for Europe initiative, a defense framework operating entirely outside American institutional control. By April, Canada had secured observer status inside GCAP, the next-generation fighter jet program being developed jointly by Britain, Italy, and Japan. A program with zero American involvement. 26 foreign trips in his first year as Prime Minister. 26, that is not a travel schedule, that is a strategic blueprint, and every single move was visible from Washington. So when you sit inside the Pentagon and watch this pattern unfold, what do you see? You see a Canadian Prime Minister with one of the most sophisticated financial backgrounds of any G7 leader. Former Governor of the Bank of Canada, former Governor of the Bank of England, a man who spent decades managing sovereign risk and asymmetric financial leverage at the highest levels of the global economy. And you watch him systematically and methodically building alternatives to American dependency across trade, defense, technology, and intelligence. Quietly, deliberately, with a precision suggesting every move was calculated well in advance. And then you see him keep the F-35 fighter jet contract in review limbo while doing all of it. The F-35 contract is one of the most significant military procurement decisions in Canadian history. The original 2023 agreement was signed at 19 billion Canadian dollars for 88 aircraft. Canada's Auditor General has since flagged that full life cycle costs have ballooned to approximately $27.7 billion. Canada has firmly committed to only 16 aircraft so far. The remaining 58 jets still sit in review, still undecided, still leverage. And that leverage brings us to one of the most quietly dramatic developments in this entire story, something that got almost zero coverage in American media. The Swedish defense company Saab just walked into the Canadian defense market and placed what might be the most aggressive military-industrial pitch any non-American supplier has ever attempted in Canadian history. Here's what they put on the table. The JAS-39 Gripen E fighter jet, but the offer is far more than an aircraft. Domestic assembly operations built inside Canada, more than 12,000 sustained Canadian jobs, a delivery window of approximately 5 years from contract signing. And then there is the detail that changes everything. Saab is offering to build a sovereign data center in Montreal. A dedicated facility hosting the mission systems, the encrypted operational flight data, and the entire software architecture for the Canadian fleet on Canadian soil, under Canadian law, under Canadian control. Compare that to the F-35. Lockheed Martin's aircraft routes critical mission data and operational flight systems through servers controlled by the United States government. Under normal circumstances, that arrangement is unremarkable between allies. But we are not in normal circumstances. We are in a moment where the United States just suspended an 86-year-old defense board as a political pressure tactic. And in that context, the question of who controls the servers running your Air Force is no longer a technical footnote. It is a sovereignty question. And Canada is now being forced to answer it out loud. Lockheed Martin is not walking away quietly. The American manufacturer announced plans to establish a major F-35 sustainment depot in Mirabel, Quebec, that could service Allied aircraft across the entire region. Lockheed also pointed to over 110 Canadian companies already embedded in the F-35 supply chain, with projected industrial benefits reaching $15.5 billion through 2058. The economic case for the F-35 is real. The jobs are real. Walking away carries genuine cost. This is not a simple decision with a clean answer. But here's what I need you to think about carefully, because this is where the mainstream coverage completely falls apart. Canada just hit the NATO 2% GDP defense spending target for the first time since the Berlin Wall fell. Total defense spending in fiscal 2025 to 2026 exceeded 63 billion Canadian dollars, an additional 9.3 billion compared to the previous year. The single largest year-over-year increase in Canadian defense spending in generations. And yet the Pentagon's demand isn't 2%. It's 3.5% on military spending plus an additional 1.5% on defense infrastructure. 5% of GDP total by 2035. Let's put that number in real terms. Canada's total federal budget sits at approximately $450 billion. 5% of GDP works out to roughly $150 billion every single year for a decade dedicated entirely to defense. That is approximately 1/3 of Canada's entire current federal budget. Every year, sustained. While managing an aging population, a housing crisis, crumbling infrastructure, and an economy where average families are already stretched on groceries and mortgages. The C.D. Howe Institute, one of Canada's most rigorous economic policy organizations, has stated plainly that the current Canadian fiscal framework is structurally incapable of supporting that trajectory. The most recent federal budget contained no 5-year defense spending projection at all. So yes, there is a kernel of legitimate policy concern buried in Washington's frustration. Ottawa hasn't produced a credible long-term spending roadmap. That's real. But there is an enormous difference between raising a legitimate concern and weaponizing an 86-year-old defense institution as a bargaining chip during active trade negotiations. And that distinction is the fault line running through this entire crisis. Here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to hear your answer in the comments. If you were sitting in Carney's chair right now, knowing Washington just froze the foundational pillar of North American defense cooperation, knowing Canada just hit its NATO target for the first time in 30 years, knowing Sweden is offering sovereign data control and 12,000 jobs, knowing the new demand is 5% of your entire GDP, what would you do? Pull back the diversification strategy and try to bring Washington back to the table. Or read this freeze as the ultimate confirmation that building alternatives was the right call from the very beginning. Drop your answer below because that question is not hypothetical. It is sitting on Carney's desk right now. To understand the full gravity of this moment, you need to zoom out, because Canada is not alone in what it's doing, not even close. The European Union just concluded a landmark trade agreement with Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay after 25 years of stalled negotiations. The EU signed deals with Indonesia and India. It reopened talks with Malaysia, the Philippines, and the United Arab Emirates. The Council on Foreign Relations, tracking this global pattern, used a specific phrase to describe what's driving these moves: hedging against uncertainty. That is the exact language Carney used in Davos. It is the same language appearing in policy documents from Tokyo to Brussels to New Delhi. What we are witnessing is not a Canada-US dispute. It is the early stage of a fundamental realignment of the global alliance architecture. Middle powers across multiple continents simultaneously building structural alternatives to American-led systems, not out of hostility, out of rational calculation that in the current environment, total dependency on a single partner is a strategic liability no serious government can afford. There is historical precedent worth examining. In 2018, Mexico faced striking parallels to what Canada faces today. Tariff threats, economic coercion, a deeply asymmetric trade relationship with Washington. Mexico's response was not confrontation. Mexico City quietly accelerated trade agreements with the EU and Asia Pacific, locking in alternative markets over a multi-year horizon. By the time the next wave of pressure arrived, Mexico had structural options it previously lacked. Real alternatives, the ability to absorb pressure without immediate capitulation. The lesson is clear: diversification works, but only if you build the alternatives before the pressure peaks. Carney appears to understand this at a level most political leaders simply don't. Now, in the interest of fairness, the American position deserves honest examination. The Pentagon's concern about NORAD modernization is genuinely serious. Hypersonic missiles now travel at speeds that make traditional early warning systems dangerously inadequate. Surface-hugging cruise missiles can evade radar arrays designed for an entirely different threat environment. The proposed integrated air and missile defense architecture represents an enormous undertaking that cannot function without synchronized bilateral investment and planning. When a Pentagon official says NORAD's effectiveness depends on Canada contributing proportionately, that is technically accurate. You cannot build a seamless missile defense umbrella over a continent when one partner's contribution falls short of what the threat environment demands. The frustration in Washington is not manufactured. The question is whether freezing the institutional foundation of 86 years of continental defense cooperation is a proportionate response to a spending disagreement, whether an alliance mechanism becomes a bargaining chip, and whether doing so sends a signal to every other American ally watching that the instruments of partnership are conditional on political compliance. Because they are watching in Berlin, in Tokyo, in Canberra, in Seoul. Every NATO member, every Five Eyes partner is absorbing the lesson this moment teaches. And the lesson is the one Carney articulated in Davos. If you want genuine sovereignty in 2026, you cannot route all your critical systems through a single capital that has just demonstrated willingness to freeze the instruments of partnership as a negotiating tool. Once an institution can be frozen for political reasons, it is a different kind of institution. Once an alliance can be suspended over a speech, it carries different weight forever after. That is not reversible. That trust, that assumption that the mechanism itself was above the political moment, is gone now. And its absence will shape calculations far beyond Canada's borders for years to come. So where does this go from here? 3 scenarios, and only one of them fits the current trajectory. The optimistic scenario has the freeze quietly thawing after Ottawa produces a credible defense spending roadmap. The F-35 review concludes with a workable deal, and the relationship recalibrates without lasting damage. Possible. But it requires Canada to deliver a fiscal plan that doesn't currently exist, and Washington to accept something less than unconditional compliance. Neither condition is in place. The scenario that should concern everyone has the freeze hardening over months. Ottawa reads it as confirmation that diversification was correct all along and continues accelerating. Saab advances in the fighter competition. Canada deepens SAFE and GCAP engagement. European and Indo-Pacific partnerships lock in. And over 3 to 5 years, Canadian strategic orientation drifts in ways that become structurally permanent, not a dramatic rupture, a quiet, compounding shift with consequences that accumulate until they can no longer be reversed. The third scenario requires a Trump-Carney diplomatic breakthrough on trade that creates enough goodwill for defense cooperation to snap back as part of a broader deal. It's possible, but it requires personal rapport between those two leaders that current evidence simply does not suggest exists. When you look at the last 4 months honestly, the second scenario is most consistent with what is actually happening on the ground. The first requires conditions that aren't present. The third requires chemistry that hasn't materialized. The second simply requires Carney to keep doing what he's already been doing. And the momentum already built makes continuation the path of least resistance. One final dimension of this story deserves attention: the way Carney himself is managing the immediate crisis. When the freeze was announced, his public response was almost impossibly calm. He told reporters he would not overplay the importance of this development. A sitting prime minister whose country's primary defense forum has just been suspended by its most important ally, and he's downplaying it. That sounds like denial. It isn't. That is a central banker's response to asymmetric leverage. His entire professional career was spent in exactly these kinds of scenarios. Currency crises where panic destroys outcomes. Debt restructurings where maintaining public stability while quietly building solutions is the only viable path. Getting drawn into a public confrontation with Washington would immediately harden positions on both sides and eliminate the diplomatic space needed for resolution. So he's keeping the temperature down publicly while the actual work happens in private channels, keeping NORAD cooperation, Five Eyes intelligence sharing, and the Defense Production Sharing Agreement all running on their separate tracks, untouched by the political storm around the board itself. It is a sophisticated play. Whether it works depends entirely on what Washington does next, and the next 6 to 12 months will answer that question in a way that cannot be walked back. This is the real story. Not just the freeze, not just the fighter jets, not just the spending numbers. The real story is what this moment reveals about the world we are now living in. The post-World War II institutional architecture, built on the assumption of stable and reliable American partnership, is under stress it has never experienced before. And into that environment steps a leader with a central banker's analytical detachment and a clear-eyed understanding of what unchecked dependency actually costs. He's not making speeches about betrayal. He's building options quietly, patiently, and with a precision that looks like passivity from the outside, but is in reality something far more deliberate. The decisions made in the next 12 months will matter for decades. But the moment of the freeze itself, the moment Washington demonstrated that an 86-year institutional pillar was not above political leverage, that moment cannot be unmade. Its effects are already spreading through the calculations of every government that built its security on the assumption of American constancy. That is the story the headlines are missing, and if you want to keep receiving the stories that actually matter before the rest of the world catches up, subscribe right now. This channel exists for the people who refuse to settle for surface-level coverage, the ones who want to understand what is actually happening and why it matters. That's who you are, and that's exactly what we're here for.